Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello. Thank you so much for listening to the Sound Bites podcast. It's been a while since I did an intro with announcements, so I wanted to be sure to let you know the great news that I'm now offering free continuing education for select podcast episodes. And I'm excited to tell you that not only are these CEUs available to registered dietitian nutritionists and dietetic technicians registered, but they are also available for certified diabetes care and education specialists. For more details about this and to see the episodes currently available in my CEU library, please go to soundbitesrd.com and click on the CEU tab at the top right. As of today, there are 11 episodes approved on a variety of topics ranging from soy to gut health to MSG, brain health, prediabetes, and sustainable nutrition. And there are many more coming soon. And if you're not looking for CEUs, don't worry. Those episodes in the CEU library are really great episodes that anyone can enjoy. Now, I also want to give a shout out to my partner, the International Food Information Council. Be sure to visit their site at foodinsight.org to get their new 2020 Food and Health Survey info and other great information and resources, and sign up for their email updates. I hope you enjoy today's episode with Yanni Papanikolaou on nutrition research. We spend the first 20 minutes talking about Yanni's interesting and somewhat extreme nutrition and fitness experiment before we dive into nutrition research, and I think you might find it interesting. As always, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and my newsletter so you never miss an update or a new episode, and share it with others if you like what you're hearing. Reach out to me by email or on social media with any feedback at any time. I'm at melissa@soundbitesrd.com and at melissajoyrd on Twitter and Instagram. Take care and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about evidence-based nutrition, nutrition research, epidemiology, and something called NHANES, and a few other topics that we're going to touch on. My guest today is Yanni Papanikolaou. He is a nutrition research scientist with a Master of Public Health. He's working on his PhD at the University of Toronto, and that research is related to type 2 diabetes. So I'm very interested in touching on that as well. But Yanni is an accomplished peer-reviewed author in scientific journals, book chapters, and he's presented at domestic and international nutrition conferences. Welcome to the show, Yanni.
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me on the show.
This has been a long time coming.
Yes.
I think we first met at an international conference in Portugal. We might have met before then, but I remember that one distinctly. I've seen you speak at several conferences on a variety of topics, and we've had the opportunity to get to know each other. And so I wanted to bring you on the show to talk about nutrition research in general, but in particular, epidemiology, since that's your area of expertise. And also, since you're a co-author on numerous NHANES studies, I thought it would be really nice to dig into NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, kind of what that is and how it's done and how it's used. But first, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and experience.
Yeah, sure. You're right. I think we did meet in Lisbon, the Food and Nutrition Conference, Foodfluence. And then for some reason, we seem to bump into each other at airports.
Yeah. Not so much these days, but...
Not so much these days, yeah. But soon. We will bump into each other soon. I strongly believe that. My background, I did my undergraduate in nutrition at University of Western Ontario, just outside Toronto, so I'm Canadian. And then I did my master's studies in nutrition at University of Toronto. And then I'm now also, as you mentioned, completing my PhD in nutrition at the University of Toronto. During my master's program, I actually had the opportunity to do an internship. So it was actually part of the master's requirements to graduate. You had to complete 2 internships. And my first internship was at Nestle Canada. And then my second internship was at Nestle USA, based in Glendale, California, just outside of Los Angeles. And it's there that I started to get an appreciation of how nutrition influences food industry and how evidence-based nutrition is important for various nutrition strategies within food companies. And up until then, I didn't really have an interest in working in the food industry. My interest was actually going to pursuing a traditional medical degree. So it's that internship, that public health internship, that actually opened, I guess, my career into working with the food industry.
Very interesting. I did not know that. And I'm glad you brought the food industry into this because I know that that is a strong part of your background. And some of what we touch on will be related to the food industry and possibly even getting some insight on industry funded research. So, one of the questions I had for you before we start diving into nutrition research and all that comes along with that, I just have to say, and I'm not putting you on the spot because I ran this by you first, but when we were in Portugal, I learned that well, first of all, you're Canadian, but you're Greek.
Right. What gave that away?
The name, right. And you lived in Portugal with your wife and kids. Is it Portugal where you lived?
I think what you're remembering is my wife, her parents are from Portugal.
That's right.
So we've spent a lot of time visiting Portugal, but we've never actually lived there.
Right.
I am a little biased because I am married to a Portuguese descendant, but it's my favorite place on this earth. Of all the places I've visited so far, and I've been to 20 countries, it's my favorite country.
Wow.
The people are amazing. The food is amazing. The beaches are amazing. And I don't work for the Portuguese tourism board.
No hashtag client. Okay. Or hashtag sponsored. Very good. Okay. And bringing your wife into the conversation because you and your wife had like this sort of nutrition and fitness quest, if you will.
Yep.
You tried some interesting experiments, and I was at dinner with you and about 5 other dietitians who, by the way, happen to be experts in sports nutrition. So the funny thing is you were trying to tell this story of this kind of extreme nutrition and exercise quest that you and your wife did that resulted basically in a photo shoot where, I mean, you guys look like you could be on the cover of Serious Fitness and Muscle magazine. It was like amazing. I really wanted to hear the story.
Thank you.
No, and people can go on your Instagram and see the pictures, and maybe I'll post them in my show notes. I was just showing them to my daughter before this because she's like, well, who's on the podcast today? And I'm like, Yanni. And I'm like, look at the pictures of his wife too. Look at this. So anyway, she's like, wow, the pictures are really amazing. But these 5 sports nutrition experts would not even let you get a full sentence out. They kept cutting you off and interrupting and challenging you like, why did you do that? You know better. You're a PhD. So I want you to share the story uninterrupted.
Yep.
If I have questions, I will write them down while you're talking, uninterrupted, about why you and your wife did this, what you did, and what your experience and your takeaway was from it.
Okay, yeah. My wife has always been a big fitness person. I have not been traditionally. It's only because of my wife, actually my wife and my kids, I decided to do what I call a personal experiment. I guess it started about 5 years ago. We were sitting at the dinner table, and like many American and Canadian adults, my weight was, even though I'm trained in nutrition, my weight was slowly increasing. And I had noticed it, but not really paid too much attention to it. But at one point, I remember we were just getting dinner ready for the kids. And my 6-year-old at the time, she said to me, Dad, I have a question for you. I said, sure. She goes, when will I become fat? And I'm like, well, why would you think you're going to be fat? And she goes, well, you told me that I share some of your genes and I share some of Mom's genes. And well, you're kind of fat. So that means I'm going to be fat. And at that point, I was like, whoa. I turned to my wife and I'm like, she thinks I'm fat. And my wife's like, well, and I'm like, what? What did happen?
Out of the mouths of babes.
Yeah. So I said to her, maybe you're right. Maybe I could lose 5-10 pounds. And my wife's like looking at me, I think you can lose more. And I'm like, wow. So I actually weighed myself for the very first time. And I'm 6'1". And it's funny because people say I carry my weight well, but I had peaked at 257 pounds. Okay. And that weight was too high, especially for me. So fast forward, I joined the gym and I started looking at my food that I was consuming and being very conscious of it and started recording information what I was eating. And I started to lose weight, but it was taking a long time. So for example, in the first year, it took, I'd say I lost about 10 pounds, which is pretty good, but was always wondering, can I do better? And it was around that time that we bumped into another parent at our kid's school. He's an engineer and he travels a lot. And there was a time period where we hadn't seen him for 6 months. And I remember him being an overweight individual. But then when we saw him 6 months later, he was just very fit. He was ripped. I mean, the guy looked like he was out of a Hollywood movie. And both my wife and I were like, what did you do? And he goes, I've tried this new program. And he goes, it's actually run by a trainer who owns a gym. It's called the Fit Effect, just about 10 minutes from our house. And he said, he's hosting an open house. You should come by. So we went by. We met our trainer, he wasn't our trainer at the time, but he introduced himself. His name's Nick. And you can check out Nick Hayward, the Fit Effect. You can check out his Instagram page. And he looks like, think of The Rock, the actor.
Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Yeah, Dwayne The Rock Johnson. He looks like that, if not more fit, if you can imagine. And he said, well, what are your goals, to both me and my wife? And my wife started listing all her goals. And she goes, well, what about you? And I said, well, I don't know. I haven't really thought about this. And I realized that we weren't just interviewing him. He was interviewing us as well. And he does not take on just anyone who comes to him. He wants you to be goal-oriented and he wants you to be committed. Long story short, we decided to join. And for me, it took me about 8 months. And this is the other thing. He holds you accountable and he doesn't force you, but he highly persuades you to do a photo shoot. And by doing a photo shoot, it makes you really, at first I was like, no, I'm not going to do a photo shoot. That's just not me. I'm a professional. I don't want people seeing me without a shirt. And then I thought, you know what? What's the big deal? And it held me accountable because I thought if I'm going to step in front of a camera in 8 months, 9 months, whatever time period it is, you know what? I'm going to take this seriously and I'm going to follow the program. So a lot of the techniques that he was prescribing, how should I say this? I guess they could be interpreted as controversial.
Maybe extreme.
So for example, you do 2 to 3 sessions with him a week. He trains you with weights, with using your body weight, resistance exercises. There's a lot of cardio. And there are times, and they're only 30-minute sessions, but within the first 5 minutes, especially in the beginning when I was non-conditioned, I felt like I was going to vomit. And there were times where I did vomit.
Wow.
That is a sign of basically not being fit. And I quickly got over that. But some people see that as, well, you're hurting yourself. Well, I decided that I was going to try it because at heart, I'm a scientist. And to me, this was a personal experiment. I would love to take this to the next level. And instead of just me or my wife doing it, I would love to run this program that he has created out of a university, out of an academic situation, using a controlled, randomized research trial approach. And it's funny, I spoke with, there's a professor, his name is Stuart Phillips, and he's out of McMaster University.
Yep, he's been on the show before.
Oh, he has? Okay. He's one of the few people that I've talked to that is like, you know what? He goes, everything you're doing is exactly where the science is heading. So he's very much, so for example, when I was having this conversation that you alluded to in Lisbon, they were very much against the fact that I was increasing my protein intake. And during training, I increased my protein intakes to 275, 280 grams per day.
Wow.
And they're like, that's way too much. You're going to damage your kidneys. And I've talked to Stu, and Stu's like, you know what? Because there's no evidence that anything that you're doing is harmful to your body. If anything, you're making your body stronger. So in the end, it took 7 months, and I lost 50 pounds of fat and put on 20 pounds of muscle.
Wow. Well, and you mentioned protein. It wasn't just the fitness aspect. There was some pretty significant dietary changes as well. And, for everybody listening, it just found this an interesting story that I couldn't get to hear because the sports dietitians were, better, you have a PhD, or you're working on your PhD, all this stuff. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity to share it. But we are in no way saying, go out and do this. But I loved the fact that you had this personal experiment. And that's how I viewed when I started running. That was an experiment because I hated running. And that led to me doing a triathlon, which some people would think is crazy, which it was a sprint triathlon. It wasn't crazy. But I wanted to see what my body could do. I wanted to push my body in what I thought was a safe way, no injuries or anything too crazy like that. But tell us a little bit about, and again, we don't want to trigger anybody's diet culture, scars or wounds by any means, but tell us a little bit about some of the nutritional changes that you made, and also maybe not too in depth, but there was some things that led up to the photo shoot where you're like, yeah, this is very extreme and certainly not anything that you would live with long term.
Right. So one of the big changes, we talked about protein. So I increased my lean protein intake. So it would be a lot of chicken, a lot of lean beef, a lot of fish, but getting to 250, 275 grams of protein per day is very difficult. So you need to have, in addition to food sources, you take dietary supplements. So there's a lot of protein drinks, protein bars. And if you're not what you would describe as a picky eater, adding more protein to your diet is actually really easy. But you have to be able to enjoy seafood. You have to be able to enjoy meat proteins. And then there's plant protein sources. If you like seafood, scallops, shrimp, there's so many different options. I also increased my fruit and vegetable intake. So I was eating a lot of dark green, leafy vegetables. One thing that I noticed I wasn't doing in the past, even though I knew, from my studies, water. I would drink so much water. I completely eliminated alcohol from my diet. And it's funny because I didn't think I actually consumed that much alcohol, but I limited sugar from my coffee as well. And I tend to enjoy coffee. So I probably have on average 4 to 5 a day. But just the sugar and the alcohol, so wine and beer, from my diet, I calculated I was eliminating about 10 to 15,000 calories a month just from those two. So alcohol and added sugars. So that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Again, water. When I'm training, I'm drinking easily, if you think of the water bottles, probably 15 to 20 a day of water bottles, if not more at times. So you're constantly going to the bathroom.
Yeah.
But in order to have success, your body needs that water to keep your metabolism going. Now, you mentioned the photo shoot, and this is controversial in the fitness world. So, for example, whenever you see an actor on the cover of a magazine, so I think of, I forget his name now, Hugh, he plays Wolverine on X-Men. Hugh Jackman. You see him when he's in his prime for those movies, and you see him on the cover of Men's Health, and you can see every muscle in his body. Well, the way they get that is they actually dehydrate. So Hugh Jackman would dehydrate anywhere from probably 24 to 48 hours before that photo shoot. So it's very limited water, and they eat a lot of carbohydrates. So your muscles actually get plumped up from the carbohydrates. And because you're dehydrated, it's almost like it amplifies your muscle definition. But that's only done for photo shoots, and anything beyond, for me, I've only done it for 24 hours, and anything beyond that is not healthy, not sustainable, in my opinion. But doing it for 24 hours is a fun experiment. It's fun because you can see how your muscles are enhanced, but you can't expect to look like that every day of the week.
Right. Yeah, you can't just walk around dehydrated.
Hydration is such an important part of health. And this can only be done if you really know what you're doing.
Don't try this at home.
Yes, and you can see how this would be controversial with
sports dietitians
talking to at the food conference.
Yeah.
But again, I did it in a very healthy manner, and it's a fun experiment. It's fun to see how much you can accomplish if you follow disciplined food nutrition and exercise regime.
Would you say now what habits have changed from the past that you do live with every day that you carry on? Sounds like drinking a lot of water. Are you still doing any diet modifications? Are you still doing the exercise?
One thing that I do regularly, I maintain my cardio. The whole exercise program is not something that you just do once and then expect to maintain all your achievements. For me personally, I will have to, and I recommend this for a lot of people, maintaining cardio. I have to do cardio at least 3 to 4 times a week. That helps me keep the weight I want to maintain. And I've noticed a difference in terms of being able to run and play with my kids. It makes a big difference when that heart is healthy and conditioned. It makes a big difference. I drink lots of water. I do enjoy alcohol. I'm not going to give up my wine. I love red wine, but I'm going to be conscious of the amount of wine I drink. So, for example, if I know this weekend I'm going to have friends over, okay, well, not this weekend because we're still in COVID. I'm still in some type of lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
But if I know that, we're having a party or we're going to a party and I'm going to be drinking wine, well, then you know what? Maybe I'll bump up my cardio that week. I'll take steps to make sure that I'm doing something to counter the wine consumption. Or if I'm going out for, maybe I'm going out for burger and fries. There's all these foods that I love that I'm not just going to eliminate, but I'm not going to eat them every day.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then just one more quick question. Did you see any improvement in your labs?
You know what? I've always said I'm going to do that, and I've never done it. I've never taken a blood sample pre and post. It's actually too bad because I should have taken a blood sample before I even started this program. What I have is measurements, body measurements, fat caliper measurements, but I've never done any biochemistry. However, it's interesting now. I'm thinking that I'm probably up about 10 pounds with it's called the COVID, the diet. There's been so many movie nights with the kids where the snack foods come out, the chips.
It's hard right now.
Yeah. So I should do a blood sample now. And then once I get back into the gym on a regular basis and do my next training session, my next round of trainings, maybe I should do it. So it's a good idea. I'm going to note that.
Yeah. So you never had, as far as you knew, like a high cholesterol or anything like that?
No, I did have years ago. So yeah, pre my training, I did go in and I had some blood drawn. But again, this was way before I started my training session. At one point, I did have low HDL levels.
Okay.
It's interesting because
be higher now.
Yeah, actually, I could actually go to my family doctor because she has all that data. I could probably, even though it was still
way back, but it's still a baseline.
It's still some type of baseline.
Yeah, check it out.
Yeah.
Be interesting. Yeah. No, I know it's really hard right now. I mentioned on the show before that my husband and my daughter, who's home from college, have both lost about 10 pounds. And I'm like, well, what were you people eating when you weren't here? My son is going through a huge growth spurt. He just finished 6th grade. And I think my weight's pretty stable, but I definitely don't feel like I'm eating as healthy. Like we have foods on hand that I don't normally keep, like chips and candy. M&Ms are my kryptonite. And, those things are at home now. And my kids are both out of school. And I thought this morning, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're sad, they're sedentary, and they're snacking all the time. Like I think we kind of need to, now that my son, he just finished yesterday, and my daughter's been done since late April. So now that they're both done, I think I'm going to try to carve out some time to step away from the podcast a little bit. I'll still be putting out regular episodes, but I carve out a little bit of time for us to create our summer schedule that, some activities and some healthy behaviors. But anyway, I digress. Okay. So, Yanni, let's talk about nutrition research and epidemiology in particular.
Yep.
I'd like to hear from your standpoint. Isn't most nutrition research epidemiology? And what does it mean? What are the pros and cons and the limitations sort of inherent in nutrition research?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work with the food industry. And a lot of people don't know this, but food industry, anytime that they want to make a claim on packaging, nutrition claim on packaging, in commercials, in communications of any sort, they need to have evidence to back it up. And epidemiology offers a lot of that evidence only because there's more nutrition epidemiology available. So, for example, you hear about randomized clinical controlled trials, and those are the gold standard for nutrition research. However, they're very, very expensive. And at times, it's only, if you think of pharmaceutical companies, they're the ones that can have the budgets to conduct these studies because they can take years at times, and we're talking millions and millions of dollars. Where doing epi studies, much like the NHANES work, it's not as expensive, and you can actually turn around and get answers in a relatively quick time. So if you think of, we're in the process right now, the US government is they're currently in the process of developing the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans, and they'll rely on randomized clinical trials that are available. But a lot of their recommendations actually stem from NHANES and epidemiological data.
So you mentioned the pharmaceutical companies having the money to do it, but also, and correct me if I say anything wrong, it's basically easier when you're just doing pills, prescriptions, placebos, things like that versus food
Right,
and
correct.
diet.
That's a great point. So when you're testing a drug, you're really looking to see the effect of that drug. When you're looking at diet, there's so many variables that come into play, so many different foods, and getting someone to participate in a study where it's controlled in the sense, first of all, you can only control it so much. So the participants come in, you can give them a dietary treatment that you're testing, and then they can come in on a different day and have a placebo. But what about the hours that they're not at the testing facility? What are they doing? Are they controlling their exercise, or are they doing what they're not supposed to be doing? It's very hard to control. Where if you're looking at a drug study, there's just more control for the researcher. Yeah, so back to the epi data, epi studies allow you, number one, to get an answer to a research question rather quickly. And again, epi studies, like every type of study, has its pluses and minuses. And we'll get to that as we talk about NHANES and the advantages and disadvantages of NHANES.
Okay, great. So NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, as you know, some of my listeners are dietitians and health professionals, but others are not. They may or may not be familiar with this term. So what is it and what's it used for?
NHANES, as you said, stands for the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And it's been around since the 60s, and it's run by the CDC. It's a program of studies designed to assess the health and nutritional status of kids and adults in the US. So in addition to food intake, the survey measures medical, dental, physiological measurements, and they have lab tests as well. So you have this rich database that includes the different foods that Americans eat, but at the same time, we also have blood samples, we have blood pressure measurements, we have heights and weights, we have whether individuals have been diagnosed with a disease, we have cognitive assessments. So it's actually a fantastic and a large database. It's funny because I'm in Canada and we are just now starting to get a database that is similar, but even then, it's not as rich as the American NHANES database. So I considered Americans quite fortunate to have it.
Okay. You said it's been around since the 60s. And I don't know if this is the correct terminology, but it's, I would say, updated or added to like every
year. The survey examines a nationally representative sample of about 5,000 people every year. And a new data set is released every 2 years.
Okay. Because I know, like, if I today went to look, I wouldn't be getting 2020 data, but I would be getting the most recent that was released. They continually collect.
Correct. So the most recent data would be the 2016 to 2018 data, which is just starting to come out. So some of it has come out already.
And how is the food and nutrition information collected? Because I think that is interesting and kind of poses some of the pros and cons involved.
Yep. There's day one and day two intakes. So in day one, that's when the actual in-person interviews happen. And these are highly trained individuals who go out into the communities. And it's actually kind of cool. But there's actually mobile units. So think of like big vans that go out and they're like fully loaded to do all these tests. But basically, an interviewer will sit down with an individual and they'll ask them questions about the types of food and beverages they consume, dietary supplement intakes. And then this doesn't happen just once, called the automated multiple pass system. So there's a series of 5 steps. So they'll ask you about what you ate, and then 15 minutes later, they'll ask you the same question, but in a different format. So they want to make sure that what they're capturing is actually the real intake. Because one of the disadvantages of NHANES is memory recall bias.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes people will be very nervous about reporting how much food they actually consume, especially when it's a food they know they shouldn't be consuming. They might underreport it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's procedures that have been put in place that can actually tweak that type of bias out.
Yeah, certainly the recall aspect, remembering what you actually did and trying to eyeball amounts. I don't know how much they get into that.
Well, they actually have food models. So, for example, they'll have a model of, okay, someone says, I had this much spaghetti. And they're like, okay, well, they'll bring out a model of spaghetti and they'll say, would you say it's closer to this amount or this amount? So they have visuals that help.
So the recall aspect, and then as you said, it's not that people are necessarily lying, but it's human nature. Even if we don't even realize we might be underreporting something or overreporting something based on that sort of judgment factor. What other issues come into play with, and you just started talking about day one, and so I want to hear about day two, like what other factors come into play with gathering this type of data?
Well, it's interesting. I can talk about one of the latest studies that we're doing with NHANES. We're actually looking at animal protein versus plant protein consumption. The reason we're doing this, there's actually several reasons. Lately, animal protein and meat in particular have been taking a big hit in the media. If you're familiar with the Eat Lancet Commission report, they made a statement where they actually identified a healthy diet as being, they described it as a diet largely consists of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and unsaturated oils, includes a low to moderate amount of seafood and poultry, and includes no or a low quantity of added sugar, refined grains, and starchy vegetables. We looked at that and thought, okay, well, why no meat? And then Health Canada introduced their new food guide, and it presented a visual of what your plate should look at. And again, there's very little meat. And then there was a study, and this is the big reason why we're doing this. We've done some of this work already. There was a study published back in 2014, and it was published in a very high-end journal. By high-end journal, I mean a journal that has a high reputation. Now, it's a scientific journal. It's called Cell Metabolism, and they don't necessarily publish nutrition type work, but in this case they did. And the study was basically saying that, and they used NHANES, and the researchers were saying that there was higher protein intakes were linked to a 75% increase in overall mortality, so death, and a 4-fold increase in cancer and diabetes, death from cancer or diabetes. But if you ate plant proteins, some of these effects on death were reduced. So basically, the takeaway was eating animal protein, meat, causes you to live a less amount of years, so earlier death. But if you're eating plant proteins, you're actually going to live longer. So we looked at this study, and it was actually Stu Phillips who called us up and said, hey, have you seen this study? He goes, you do more work with NHANES. He goes, but I've seen all these issues with this study. And so the other researcher I work with is Dr. Victor Falgoni, based out of Michigan. We all got on a phone call and we're like, you know what, there's a lot of problems with this study. First of all, yes, it used NHANES, but we just talked about day one and day two intake data. They just use day one intakes. And day one intakes are fine, but not when it comes to looking at a mortality study. So the National Cancer Institute has said, well, if you're going to do a mortality assessment, you can't just use day one intakes. You have to use what's called the usual intake. And usual intake is a statistical procedure that National Cancer Institute has created, and it accounts for day one and day two intakes, but then a host of other variables, because food intake that is only captured for one day is not reflective of a total diet. So immediately we saw that there was all these issues with the study. So we decided, let's use NHANES. Let's use the National Cancer Institute's methodology of using usual intake, and let's rerun the study. So we'll use the same database that they used, and we've completed the first phase of the study. We've presented it at various conferences, and we're now actually putting it into a publication to submit to a medical journal. And we're not able to replicate any of the findings. So we're actually not seeing that animal protein or meat intake is linked to death from all causes, from cancer to diabetes. We're not able to replicate any of the findings. And we're actually using a stronger methodology. And one of the biggest ahas for me after doing this study was I wasn't expecting to see that consuming meat made you live less, but I didn't see any association with plant protein either. So whether you consumed animal protein or plant protein-based diet, it didn't impact how long you lived. And then we looked at different amounts. So we looked at different amounts of plant protein, different amounts of animal protein intake, different amount of meats, and we couldn't find any associations. Where we did find associations was, and this is not rocket science, age. So as you age, the closer you get to death. We found that association.
Wow.
Yeah. We found that smoking was significantly associated with death. So if you smoked, you were likely to die earlier than someone who didn't smoke. And not consistently, but in many situations, we found that if you were not in a healthy BMI, or if you led a lifestyle that was sedentary and didn't exercise, you were more likely to die earlier than someone who did exercise more, who led a non-sedentary lifestyle. We also saw that if you're a female, you tend to live longer than males. But again, this is all stuff we've known.
Because we knew, we know that. Okay, let me go back and ask you then, talk to me about the day 2, because you talked about day 1, but I think we might have skipped over day 2, like what that looks like. And also you mentioned you have a stronger methodology, so I'd love to hear more specifics on that.
So day 1 is the in-person interview, and day 2 is a follow-up interview.
Like phone or?
Yeah, they call you up over the phone. It's basically they're following up on questions they asked you on day 1. If you're just going to use one, and again, it depends on what your research study is doing. For most studies, like we've done data where you don't need to use day 2, you can just rely on day 1 data. That's a fair representation of their nutrient intakes. But these are not studies that are looking at death, so associations with death. But for example, we did a study looking at egg consumers. So children who eat eggs versus children who don't eat eggs. And it was fine to just use the day 1 intake data. We've done studies where we're looking at cereal consumers, both kids and adults. And we were looking at do kids or adults who eat cereals, are there differences with their blood measurements, whether it be blood glucose, blood insulin? Do they have higher blood pressures? Do they have lower blood pressures? And that's fine. But in this study, again, we followed the method dictated by the National Cancer Institute, and we used what is called the usual intake methodology.
Okay, great. So Yanni, given some of these limitations inherent in nutrition research and epidemiology, and some of the criticism about well, people can't remember, or it's not as accurate as it would be nice if it was. Are there any thoughts on any other ways to gather this data in a more accurate way? Or what are your thoughts based on that? Because I feel like our hands are kind of tied with some of the factors that contribute to the limitations. And, it's the best data that we have, but are there any ideas on how to make it better?
At the end of the day, there's no perfect research study or perfect research methodology. Every approach will have its inherent advantages and disadvantages. But NHANES has received criticism in the past, but it really is an amazing and rich database. What's great about it is that you can sample so many individuals, and it's a sample that is nationally representative. So it's not just you're looking at the northeast or the northwest or the south, but you have a sample that's representative of the entire United States. And in addition to all the food and beverage and dietary supplement info that you're collecting, you're also collecting this rich set of information on biochemical values, physiological values. And to have that all in one survey is quite an undertaking. Well, many countries, including Canada, many countries in Europe and other parts of the world, they do collect this type of information. None that I know of are as large or as rich of a data collection as the US one. So yes, there are, again, inherent disadvantages to the survey. As we said, there's memory recall bias, there's under or over reporting, depending on the food. That should not be the reason why we're not using such a great database. There's way too many advantages when it comes to NHANES. Maybe I'm biased because I work with it. I've seen the level of training that goes into individuals who collect the information. I can easily access cholesterol levels. I can look at blood glucose measurements, insulin, C-reactive protein. I look at other studies. I wish I had that from the Canadian perspective, because I go into the Canada data and I'm like, oh, well, that's missing or this is missing, but yet it's readily available in the US.
Well, thank you. That's why I wanted to ask you, because you have worked with it so much. And it was one of the many things that we talked about last time we were in person together. And I thought, that'd be nice to kind of share a little bit about that on the show. So thank you.
If I can add, your earlier question said if there's things we can do to improve. Well, one of the things, and this came to me earlier this week because I was looking at a study, we have different epi studies, but one of the ways to strengthen these studies is to look at combined or pooled data. So, for example, if you look at a meta-analysis, which takes a whole bunch of studies on the same topic and combines them, I'm big in the animal protein discussion right now that there's a study that came out where it looked at European and American data, and they found that, for example, there was 5 studies, and they pulled them together, and it was only one study that actually showed that processed meat intake led to increased heart failure. But when you pooled all the studies, the data did not support that anymore.
Mm.
And then we found that, or the researchers found, I wasn't involved in this study, that Europeans tended to have a stronger association with processed meat intake and heart failure, but the Americans did not. And then when they did some digging, they found that Europeans were eating their processed meats with other snack foods that were higher in sugar, higher sodium, which surprisingly, the Americans were not.
Wow.
So I often go back to, you have to be careful to how do you interpret these data, because sometimes, in this case, meat is getting a bad rap, but sometimes it's what I call, you're judged by the friends you keep.
Mm.
And my mother would always say this to me. She said, be careful who you hang around with, because if there's bad seeds in that group, you could be interpreted as being a bad seed as well. Well, the same thing goes for food. Sometimes a good food hangs around other bad foods, and then it gets the perception that it's a bad food as well. I think we might be in that scenario with meat.
Interesting. Yeah, I interviewed Glenn Gazer on refined carbohydrates, guilt by association, and some of the similar. What foods are you hanging out with? It's a good point.
Yeah, I know Glenn quite well. And Glenn and I have had several conversations on this. And it's funny, he used guilt by association in his report that you interviewed him on. And I actually had this conversation with him, and I brought that concept up to him about 6 years ago. And he said, "Are you okay if I use that?" I'm like, "Absolutely. I love that."
Oh, that comes from you. I love it. Yeah, I think it makes it very clear.
And that was a great paper that Glenn put out.
Yeah, I'll link to that in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com as well. And that's an episode that I'm submitting for approval for free continuing education for dietitians. So people can look for that on my free CEU page. I'm really excited about that. There's a lot of science in that episode. So excellent. I also wanted to ask about your PhD work related to type 2 diabetes and cognition. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're looking at feeding. So the work that we've completed, it's actually all the research has been completed at the University of Toronto at St. Michael's Hospital, where we focused on feeding elderly participants, so older adults, with different type of carbohydrate foods and seeing how it would impact their memory performance. And I am definitely not an expert in memory assessment. So we actually teamed up with neuropsychologists at a facility in Toronto called Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. And they actually helped me put together a cognitive assessment battery. So, for example, our subject would come in the morning fasting, and we would give them either a slow release carbohydrate, in this case it was pasta, or a quick absorbing carbohydrates, something like pure sugar. And then we give them tests, different cognitive tests. So, for example, one was a word list. I would read to them, and this was all recorded, so it would maintain consistency. So I would play, and it was my voice, and I would play a list of 12 words for them. So after they consumed the test food, 15 minutes would pass. I say, "Okay, I'm going to play a list of words for you. Can you please repeat them back to me immediately after you've heard them?" So they hear them, and they repeat them back to me. And then I record how many they could recall back. I would distract them for about half an hour, and then I would say, "Hey, do you remember that list of words that you heard back when we started? Can you repeat those back to me?" And they say, "Oh, can you play them back for me?" I said, "No, I can't play them back for you. Just whatever you recall." And so they repeat those words back to me. I would do the same with I would give them a short story. I would play a short story for them, and then I would immediately have them recall it. So that's immediate recall. And then I would wait half an hour, and I would distract them. And I'd say, "Hey, do you remember that short story you heard half an hour ago? Can you repeat that to me?" Then I'd let an hour pass. I'd say, "Hey, remember that story you heard an hour ago? Can you repeat that back to me?" And we saw that when you gave them, so there was 3 conditions. There was a day they came in completely fasting, they would just get water. Then there was a day they would come in, they would be completely fasting, they would get highly absorbed carbohydrate, and then slowly absorbed carbohydrate. And on the days that they got the slowly absorbed carbohydrate, so think of slow release carbohydrate foods are like foods that have higher fiber. They cause a slow and gradual increase in blood glucose. On those days that they got that food, they actually performed better on the memory test. And in some cases, their memory improved when they had those foods.
Mm,
So it's actually quite remarkable. So
yeah.
in summary, we're assessing how different foods can impact memory in older adults, but these adults also have type 2 diabetes. So it's a very specific area of focus.
Very interesting. And when will you be wrapping up your dissertation?
Hopefully in the next 6 months.
Okay.
That's the goal.
Well, good luck with that. Before we wrap up, we had talked about the food industry a little bit, and you do a lot of work in that area. And I like to ask my guests who are involved in industry funded research to just speak to that. That gets a lot of criticism, but I like hearing from people who are involved with it. What do you say when people criticize industry funded research? What would you share?
Well, anytime I can comment on the work we do, a lot of the work I do is with my research partner, Dr. Victor Fogoni. And anytime we do a project for industry, it goes for any one that we do the research for, we discuss what they'd like to determine, so the research question. And then once we have that determination, the food industry or the client doesn't have any participation in the study. So they do not see the results. There's no data interpretation that they provide. They have no say in the manuscript. And eventually they will see the work, but once it's been submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. So we make that quite clear. And if a food industry company doesn't want to participate, we don't participate. But most of our clients are actually quite happy to follow that format. And they understand that the food industry is heavily criticized. And that's why they're taking this approach. They want to promote and encourage new research, and they have funding to do so. And it's hands off. And again, they don't have any say into how the research goes. So, we've done work where we've seen that, we did work with the Grains Food Foundation, where we saw that people who consume cakes, cookies, and pies, for example, have higher added sugar intake in their diet. But at the same time, we saw other benefits of consuming grains, and the client didn't have any say in terms of what we reported in the publications. And it worked out. I understand food industry gets criticized, but a lot of the times I feel like the food industry is not treated fairly in that sense. They're seen as this evil company that's trying to mislead.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of good folks within food industry, and I've worked with a lot of them, and I'm quite proud to be aligned with them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We always say more research needs to be done, but the government can't possibly fund everything. And I like to hear from different folks like you that the specifics about how it's done and share that out with my listeners so that they can, appreciate the information and everything that comes along with it.
Yep. It's funny because one of our research funders is the Egg Nutrition Center, and we just finished a manuscript. And I was about to send it to them. They're like, no, don't send it to us until you've submitted it to the journal. I'm like, okay. I said, but you weren't going to have a chance to input anyways. They're like, no, we don't want it. We want you to send it to the journal first. Yeah. Because again, just because
how that might look.
If I send to them, the perception could be that I'm allowing them to input into the study. That was not at all my intention. I was just sharing the final copy with them, but they were quite adamant. No, it needs to go to the journal before we see it, which tells you a lot about the food industry practices and the integrity of the food industry.
The ethics, yeah. And love the Egg Nutrition Center, by the way. They're awesome.
Well, we have some cool data coming out soon, so stay tuned for that.
I will. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share with us today before we wrap up? I know we touched on research, epidemiology, and NHANES, and a couple of the cool projects that you're working on, but was there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with our listeners?
I think you've asked me a lot of great questions. The only thing to add is, and this is something we do in our family, and again, this is not my area of research expertise, but I highly believe in it. Kids should be taught about nutrition as early as possible. It's incredible what kids absorb, and we take full advantage of that, and we teach our kids how to read labels, and we teach them about the consequences and the benefits of food choices. And we are constantly having conversations with our kids about what foods do to the body, how they help in growth and development, what does this nutrient do? And I just encourage your listeners and anyone who listens to me that this is, I think, a good approach.
It seems to be working because didn't your daughter wasn't she just the 8th grade graduation valedictorian? So she's boosting those brain cells with the proper nutrition.
I hope so. I hope my wife and I are doing, I hope we're doing the right thing. listen, it's hard raising kids. We have 3, and sometimes finding the time to have these conversations is challenging. But one of the good things about COVID is that it has allowed us to actually spend more time with them. And we've had a lot of great conversations. And sometimes they'll ask me a question. I'm like, geez, I don't know the answer to that. Let me look it up.
Right.
And it could be nutrition related. Sometimes, many times it is. And I'm like, I don't know everything in nutrition, but that's a great question. And it shows me that they're listening. And I love that.
Yeah. And one of the reasons you brought up teaching children nutrition is because I had said to you before the interview, sometimes I talk about this Do More with Dinner initiative that I don't really talk about that much anymore, but my regular listeners know about it. But maybe I should do a little update or 2.0 with the COVID situation, because a lot of it has to do with engaging dinner time conversations and, having fun and that connection with family. And, certainly I talk on the show a lot about food insecurity and shopping on a budget and getting food on the table. And that's certainly a concern for even more people right now. Maybe I'll think about putting together a little Do More with Dinner 2.0 to just try to get some more resources out to people. And I agree. It's been nice to spend more time with the family. And so far we're getting along, which is awesome. I think we, given the situation, it's not a surprise, I guess, but we've given each other a lot of grace. Like we seem to be more understanding and patient with each other, which is nice.
Yes. Same with our household.
Good. So glad to hear that. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, Yanni. Like I said, it was a long time coming, and it was really interesting to hear about all the great work you're doing.
Thank you, Melissa. It's great being on the show. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know. Soon could be a relative term, but I don't know when we're going to get back to traveling, but take care. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.